At 7 a.m, Bob's sister Anne, who had been in Hobart visiting Bob and his family and had been staying with Bob and Sue, saw Bob for the last time when she went into the kitchen to make coffee before heading back to bed. Sue and Bob left the house sometime between 8 and 9 a.m. to head down to the yacht. At 11 a.m, Sue returned to the house in Allison Street, and at 11:30 she and Anne left to have lunch together. According to police, it was 11:20 when Sue returned, but this does not fit the timeline for Sue to have left the yacht, got back to the shore, gone home, and then to the yacht club. After lunch, Sue took Anne back to the house, then returned to the yacht. According to Anne, this was sometime between 1:30 and 2 p.m. Tying in with this is the phone call that Sue made to her daughter at 1:16. Sue was at the top of Mole Street, one of Hobart's steeper hills, at the time, and corroborating this, her daughter noted that it sounded especially windy at the time that they were talking, therefore giving the impression that Sue was in an exposed location. This was another bone of contention, but the police kept saying the call was later. However, not only was Sue able to say with certainty that this was the correct time, the time could easily be corroborated since Sue's daughter made the call from her break room at her work with other staff present. A witness who was at Murrayville Esplanade that afternoon said they helped Sue to launch her dinghy at some time between 1:30 and 2 p.m, since the tide had receded and the propeller from the motor had become lodged in the mud. One witness, Jane Powell, originally said that she saw Sue in the dinghy going towards the Four Winds at 1:30 p.m. However, in her official statement, this time changed to 2 p.m. It is interesting to note here that this was one of many witness statements which were changed, with the updated statements seeming a better fit for the narrative put forward by Tas Police. 4 witnesses came forward after Bob's disappearance claiming to have seen an old grey dinghy tied up at the Four Winds between 4:30 and 5 p.m. Perhaps the clearest description of this dinghy came from an experienced yachtsman who was on his own yacht on the river at the time and passed by the Four Winds at a rather close distance of roughly 50 metres. This witness described seeing a battleship grey dinghy with lee cloth on port side of Four Winds. He stated it was definitely not the Four Winds tender. This dinghy could in no way be mistaken for the Quicksilver dinghy which belonged to Sue and Bob. Unlike the dinghy from the Four Winds, which appeared brand new, this dinghy was described as being somewhat old and tatty in appearance. Its front was pointed, unlike the Quicksilver, and it had a lee cloth over its bow to prevent water getting into it, which was not something that the dinghy from the Four Winds had. During the evening on the 26th of January, Sue made phone calls to her daughter Emma and her mother between 9:15 and 10 p.m. Then at 10:05 she received a phone call which lasted until 10:35 from a gentleman by the name of Richard King, a complete stranger who she'd not even heard of before. During this phone call, King claimed he was a friend of Bob's daughter who had been in a panic over an apparent premonition that something was going to happen to her father whilst he was on the yacht, and that the yacht was going to sink. He also made contact with Bob's son following his call to Sue, making the same claims to him. Richard King had made some particularly concerning assertions with regards to the current mental health of Bob's daughter. However, he later denied this in court. He said he also phoned Tim Chappell because of these mental health concerns, and this really worried Sue. Several hours later, still feeling extremely worried about the unsettling phone call that she had received, Sue headed back down to Murrayville Esplanade. She had earlier left the car at Murrayville Esplanade and walked home, so she decided to walk down and collect the car in case something happened with Bob's daughter and she needed the car to go to her. It was an especially dark night, far too dark to be able to see out to the yacht from the shore. Whilst she could have had a better vantage point had she gone to the end of the spit near the rowing club, she chose not to, having observed a number of homeless people congregated around a yellow car with some kind of fire going. Instead, having collected the car and feeling somewhat less anxious, she drove back home again. At 5:40 on the morning of the 27th of January, a man who had taken his daughter down to the river for rowing practice discovered the Quicksilver dinghy from the Four Winds, unsecured and bobbing against the rocks by the rowing club, and subsequently tied it to a rock to prevent it floating away or becoming damaged by the rocks. A short while later, the Four Winds was spotted sitting extremely low in the water, and police were contacted due to fears that the yacht would end up sinking. At 7 a.m. that same morning, Sue attempted to make a phone call to Bob, with whom she'd left her mobile phone overnight in case he had needed to contact her, but there was no answer. 10 minutes later, she received a phone call from the police radio room informing her that the yacht had been found sinking at its mooring.
Mum had a phone call around 7 a.m. and this was played in court from the police radio room saying, "Oh, are you the owner of Four Winds? Oh, yes. Oh, it's sinking on its mooring." And then I think Mum said something like, "Oh, Bob's on board. I've just tried to call him. He didn't answer the mobile." It was quite traumatic hearing it played because I could hear in Mum's voice I can just imagine what was running through her head.
When the family reached the Esplanade, they expected to discover Bob had previously gone ashore and was nearby. However, it soon became apparent that he was, in fact, missing. During that morning, Sue, having driven down to the Esplanade, was questioned by police, while police, civilians and salvage crew worked to salvage the yacht, with no regard to the possibility that it was, in fact, a crime scene and should have been treated as such. Later that morning, Four Winds was towed to Hobart's Constitution Dock, where Sue and her family were later encouraged to board it in order to ascertain if any items were out of place or missing. This all occurred prior to the completion of a full forensic examination. That same morning, 2 police officers went to Sue's home in Allison Street in order to take a statement from her. Sue, having been in a fugue-like state due to shock and anxiety, was medicated with Valium and therefore was not in a state to be providing any answers or information. And yet police continued with their questioning regardless, and this interview was subsequently used by detectives as evidence of deception by Sue, and, somewhat unethically, used as one of the key arguments by the prosecution in the case against Sue, where it was alleged that she had lied to hide her own guilt over Bob's disappearance and presumed death.
Oh, look, I remember she was clearly distressed and in shock and feeling sick. So once we'd left the foreshore, we went back up to Allison Street to the family home, and she was very stressed. So I remember sitting her down and saying, "Okay, Mum, when did you last see him?" She was like, I can't remember what I was doing. I couldn't get her to focus.
Was she crying?
No, she wasn't crying. She just had a really stressed and strained, anxious look on her face. There was too much adrenaline to cry. You know, like for me, I was going into strategic adrenaline, like crisis management, and she was beyond that, and just a sort of fog of stress and not being able to recall.
On that morning, when I saw the boat, I felt very strange. It was almost as if, when I was talking to people down there, that I was, walking through a thick fog, and the, things were coming and going. People would be standing right beside me, and it was as if their voices were suddenly muffled, coming from a great distance. And I don't know what that was, but it felt very strange. It was almost like walking through thick smoke on and off.
2 uniformed policemen turned up and sat down, and they took a statement from Mum, who was just in complete shock at that point.
I have absolutely no memory of going back to our house in West Hobart with 2 police officers and the family.